Thank you for joining us today for our first call for the 425 show. Thank you, Bailey and Michael, for joining us today. Again, please add your questions and comments in the chat, and we will get those answered for you today. All right, Bailey, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jamie. It's so great to be back. I know that we previously did 425 shows about a year ago and some change. And so it's wonderful to return, especially with so much professional backing. We have a fantastic team that's been working behind the scenes to get this up and running. And we have some exciting content that's going to be planned for y'all going forward. Today, we're going to be talking about macOS Platform SSO with Michael Epping, and we have some future calls that are going to span across the Microsoft security space. So jumping outside of our typical bounds of just Entra. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Michael. And if you have any questions at all, pop them in the chat. I'll be sure to interrupt Michael at good opportunities to ask those questions, especially if they pertain to certain slides. And then we can absolutely have a Q&A at the end. So with that, take it away, Michael.
Cool. Thanks, Bailey. All right, so for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Michael Epping, and I am a product manager in our customer acceleration team for Microsoft Entra. And one of the feature areas that I've worked with our feature teams on a lot is macOS features. So identity-related functionality for macOS to better integrate Macs with your Entra tenant. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about today about where we're kind of at as an industry with identity management on macOS, how we can improve things, what goes into doing those improvements, how can we troubleshoot them, and then I'll leave you with a couple concrete go-dos that hopefully will help you prioritize what sort of stuff should you go do in your own environment. So just to set a little bit of context, identity management for local accounts on the Mac has a pretty checkered history. So for a long time, Apple provided some native capability in what we would sometimes call Active Directory joining or LDAP binding, which was introduced in a pretty early version of OS X. However, this has a lot of drawbacks in a modern environment. It doesn't play super nice if users don't have line of sight to a domain controller. If the user is remote, when an Active Directory password changes, there can be a lot of user experience problems there. Getting the user back into a functional state sometimes can be fairly difficult. This was really designed for well-connected environments where users weren't really roaming outside of the corporate network. And obviously in 2024, we have a lot of users who are either doing hybrid work or remote work. And so this doesn't necessarily make sense anymore. Apple did make some minor improvements for integrating with on-prem AD in 2019 with this concept of Kerberos SSO, which is a little bit more MDM friendly, but ultimately is doing the same sorts of things. It's getting you integration with on-prem AD for the purposes of getting Kerberos tickets to access on-prem apps. At the same time, they also released this concept of Enterprise SSO, which does something very similar, but for cloud IDPs. So Entra ID being one of those cloud IDPs that added support for Enterprise SSO, this allows us to get SSO in tokens and a nice smooth user experience when accessing Entra protected resources. But none of this really accrued to doing cloud-based management of the local identities on that Mac. So there is a pretty robust ecosystem of third-party tools that have popped up over the years. Jamf Connect is a very popular one, especially for Jamf Pro customers. Xcreds is another option that does some similar things to Jamf Connect, and there's a few other vendors out there with similar products that kind of bridge this gap. They take this Mac platform that has a fairly old school on-prem AD way of doing enterprise management of user accounts, and they modernize that approach to integrate with a cloud IDP. But it's not something that's really natively coming from Apple. To some degree, these are kind of like shims that are put into the platform in order to bridge that gap. So we obviously have an issue here that we need to solve. And this is where Platform SSO is going to come in, which is something that we're going to focus on for most of the rest of this talk. So the couple issues that customers have kept bringing back to us over the years are, I still don't really have a good native solution and a good one-stop shop for identity management on my Macs. I need to have local credentials in some cases, or I need to still do on-prem AD integration, or maybe I do some lightweight management of the local identity via MDM, or maybe I use these third-party tools. it's pretty complicated. There's not really a default answer for how should I manage the local login process on my Macs. As a result, there's also a need for a lot of different tools here. You can imagine that there's a lot of customer environments out there where they're using some combination of Kerberos SSO for on-prem SSO, Microsoft Enterprise SSO for SSO to cloud resources, and then maybe a third-party tool like an Xcreds in order to manage logging into the Mac locally. It's 3 different tools to do very similar but distinct things. Those on-prem dependencies are still pretty prevalent. We do talk to a lot of organizations that have on-prem Active Directory, and they're still integrating the Macs with it. They have on-prem applications, and the more tightly you tie your Macs to that on-prem AD, the worse the end user experience tends to be, again, especially if you're an org that supports remote work or hybrid work. And then a big one that I'm going to spend a decent amount of time focusing on here, and this is really important to Microsoft, is modern phishing-resistant options. So we are making a big push to try to help customers get to phishing-resistant authentication using technology like FIDO, WebAuthn, passkeys. And macOS really needs something for doing phishing-resistant auth against Entra ID, just like Windows has with Windows Hello for Business, or like we have with passkeys on some of the mobile platforms today. So let's talk about Platform SSO and get into what is this thing and how can it actually help here. So the first thing I really want to point out is that this is not something that Microsoft just cooked up on our own. This is a native framework built by Apple into macOS itself, which is really important for us. Our strategy has generally been that we want to make sure that we take advantage of the features that Apple provides. We don't necessarily want to go build something way off on the side that is not in alignment with Apple's strategic direction on the security of their platform, where we would potentially have to go rebuild something every year when they release new macOS versions. Instead, we want Apple to provide good native identity management tools on macOS, and we will leverage them. And so Apple has done just that. With Platform SSO, they took this concept that already existed of single sign-on extensions, which we already had one of, and extended those into being able to do some amount of management of the local user account on the Macs. This is all configured via MDM, so it uses really modern management and protocols. And it does require an update to any sort of plugin that's built by the MDM vendor. And so we have a plugin for Apple's SSO framework, and we have done a bunch of work to update it. And we announced back in late April or early May that we're now ready to support this Platform SSO capability. Fundamentally, this is a replacement for binding to those on-prem directory services. We do have ways of still getting you SSO to those on-prem resources, but this really does help us take that local identity on your Mac and tie it much more closely to Entra ID than to your on-prem AD. And this really helps alleviate a lot of those issues around on-prem dependencies, line of sight requirements to domain controllers, things like that. Apple also provides us with multiple different authentication methods, and this allows us to do some things around phishing resistance as well. So on that topic, Platform SSO in Apple's framework has 3 different options that Apple provides. We tend to take a look at this as kind of a good, better, best type of framework. So on the good column, we have passwords. This is very similar to or the most similar to doing the on-prem AD integration that you would have done previously with the Kerberos SSO extension or with Active Directory joining your Macs, where essentially we are syncing the local password by making the user provide it, checking it against the identity provider, which in this case is Entra instead of an on-prem domain controller, validating if it's the right password, and then if it is, we set that password locally on the Mac to be the right one. However, this does not really move the security bar forward at all for organizations. This is really just recreating the existing functionality, and we want customers to think long and hard about, is that the right approach? Again, in our modern world where we have our identity teams rolling out things like Windows Hello for Business and passkey support, we want to be thinking about phishing-resistant auth on all of our platforms. And that goes for not just Windows, iOS, and Android, but includes macOS. So on the phishing resistant side, Apple also provides support for smart cards. Smart cards are very strong. It's a very effective phishing-resistant credential, but it does come with a lot of downsides, like you have to have a very robust PKI infrastructure. There's a lot of maintenance and process that goes into issuing smart cards. There's external hardware that you have to purchase. So this is not necessarily a great option for many organizations. If you already have an existing investment in smart cards, I would absolutely recommend that you kick the tires on this. But if you don't, we think the best option here is Secure Enclave Key. Secure Enclave Key uses the same protocols as Windows Hello for Business when authenticating against Entra ID, which is namely using the WebAuthn protocol that's part of FIDO implementation in order to authenticate and get tokens from Entra ID. This allows us to do very similar things to what we do with Windows Hello for Business, but on the Mac side. Like we can use this as a passkey for re-authentication scenarios. We can satisfy conditional access policies that require phishing-resistant authentication. And probably most importantly, this does not require external hardware. You can use the built-in Secure Enclave Key that exists inside of every Mac sold today to do this authentication and protect these credentials. So this is a really strong option that we want customers to think about. And we think that this is the best way for the vast majority of organizations to go. So let's talk a little bit how this works. I'm going to mostly focus on Secure Enclave Key, but I will talk a little bit about password sync. But regardless of which method you choose, you have to do a couple things first. The first is the Intune Company Portal app must be installed on the Mac. Obviously, this is likely to be on your Mac if you're using Intune as your MDM. If you're using a different MDM, you may need to install this through some method like pushing the application or instructing users to install it, things like that. But the Intune Company Portal app is the delivery vehicle for our authentication broker in the context of Platform SSO. So regardless of which MDM you're using, Company Portal must be present on the device. It has all the knowledge about how to work with Entra ID. Then you have to push down an MDM policy. That MDM policy is going to do a few things. And that is basically setting the Platform SSO parameters that you want used on that device. So you can see here in the screenshot that we're setting the authentication method to user secure enclave key. So this is that best option that I outlined on the previous slide. There's a bunch of other settings here that are also important, and I'll get into some of those in a little bit. But the fundamental thing that has to happen is the company portal has to be there, and you have to push down a profile that specifies a few of these settings. Otherwise, Platform SSO registration will not kick off. If you do all this properly, the next step is that we actually start doing our registration. Registration is a two-step process. The first step is what I would call device registration. Device registration always happens no matter which authentication method you choose, whether it's password, smart card, secure enclave key, does not matter. This step always occurs. So basically what happens here is the user has to provide some credentials to Entra ID. So they'll get a little Entra pop-up box saying like sign in with your corporate credentials. If they get those credentials correct, what we will do is we will ask the Mac to use the secure enclave key to generate a CERT request. We will send that CERT request to Entra ID, validate that CERT request, create a device on the Entra ID side, return some CERT material. And basically at the end of this process, we end up with a device that is Entra ID joined. And on the client side, on the device side, the device certificate is bound to the secure enclave. This is a difference from what happens previous to Platform SSO if you were integrating with Microsoft, where we would actually store the device certificate in the keychain. So we were up-leveling the security of the device identity and binding it to the secure enclave rather than putting it in the keychain, which has a couple of implications that I'll talk about in a bit. The next part of the process is the user registration. This step is different depending on if you choose password, smart card, or secure enclave key. So in the password sync flow, the user will be challenged for your Entra ID username and password. So the user will provide that username and password. It will be sent to the cloud. The cloud will check that password. If it's correct, we will send a response and a grant back saying that password was good. and then the Mac will update the local user account password to match the password used in Entra ID. And then this will be periodically checked in the background going forward. And this uses a very similar logic to how this works on Entra ID joined Windows devices. So pretty straightforward stuff for the password. If you use the secure enclave key, rather than sending a username and password over the network that can potentially be intercepted or phished or tricking the user into giving that credential up, with secure enclave key, the user authenticates locally to the device, unbinding the secure enclave or authenticating locally to the secure enclave key, which is used to generate a public key private key pair. That public key is sent to Entra ID, it is stored on the user's account, and a response is returned. And at the end of this process, there's a private key on the device that never leaves that device. It is hardware bound to the secure enclave key that can be used in a WebAuthn FIDO flow to authenticate against Entra ID. So the private key never leaves the device. The only thing the IDP has is the public key. And we're going to use this to do phishing resistant authentication, where there is not a secret that the user can give up to an attacker that the attacker can then take and go replay from anywhere, like the attacker's machine or some bot farm, etc. It cannot be stolen in that way. A couple things before I get into some demos. So most of the authentication on the device is actually still going to be based off of primary refresh tokens. So even though we are setting up these new local authentication methods on the Mac, we don't want to bombard our users with authentication prompts left and right. We want them to have a nice, smooth SSO user experience when they're signing into things. And so most of the authentication is going to take place using primary refresh tokens, just like we do on Windows, iOS, Android, etc. These PRTs are refreshed every 4 hours, roughly. And so as we refresh these PRTs, the user's SSO state will continue to function pretty much indefinitely, unless they go offline for a period of over 14 days, or something changes in their security profile, like the device gets disabled, or the user account is disabled, or the user account is deleted, or the user is marked as risky. These are events where maybe we would not allow the PRT to be refreshed silently. That passkey flow for doing the interactive phishing-resistant authentication with Entra ID is something that we really want customers to think about doing. One thing that you'll see is if you implement this is that users have to go toggle on Company Portal as a passkey provider. So as long as the user sets up Company Portal as a passkey provider, if they do run into one of these situations where they do need to interactively re-authenticate, like their risk went to high and we need them to do a fresh sign-in interactively, as long as Company Portal is turned on as a passkey provider, they can use that private key that never leaves the device in order to do a FIDO authentication to Entra ID, get new tokens, establish a new session, and they're basically using their Mac as a jumbo-sized FIDO key when they do this, and the secure enclave is that secure storage for that private key. One other thing to note is earlier I talked about how the device certificate is now being stored in the secure enclave or bound to the secure enclave. It is no longer in the keychain. So you may be familiar with some of these keychain prompts that are common in apps like Chrome or Firefox, like you see in the screenshot, where users may be challenged to enter a password so that some app can get at the device certificate that's in the keychain. This flow will no longer work because that certificate is not in the keychain. There is no certificate there for Chrome or Firefox to get access to in order to do device-based authentication with Entra ID. So applications need to talk to the Company Portal broker. The Company Portal broker is the only thing that can do device-based CA or device-based authentication and pass Entra conditional access policies that require things like a compliant device. So for Chrome, Microsoft actually did release a browser extension that allows Chrome to know how to talk to the broker. We built Edge so that Edge natively knows how to talk to the broker. Safari works out of the box because Apple did the appropriate work there. Other browser vendors may need to do some additional work to go talk to that broker. If any other apps in your environment took some sort of dependency on that cert being in the keychain, they may have similar issues and they'll need to be updated to talk to the broker instead. But most apps just use Apple's native web APIs and they can talk to the broker just using the normal Apple flows. One last thing that I want to talk about as it relates to conditional access before I demo things is when we talk about enforcing phishing resistance and authentication policies in Entra ID, where we're really talking about doing this is at what we call a policy decision point. This is actually NIST terminology for where we enforce certain policies before a user gets access to some sort of downstream resource. So in the Entra world, that downstream resource is things like private applications, networks, SaaS apps, line of business, data, pieces of your infrastructure, and this is all enforced in the conditional access engine. And so when we enforce that phishing resistant authentication, we use the same logic that we do on Windows for Windows Hello for Business. So with that secure enclave key or that smart card option, we can basically validate that the user provided some sort of memorized secret, like a PIN or a passcode, and then something they are, like a biometric, or something they have, which is the device. And so we need some combination of something they have, which is the device, meaning the smart card, or the Mac with that secure enclave key in it, as well as something they know, which is the local PIN on that Mac, or the local PIN on a Windows device, or the biometric, which would be Touch ID on the Mac, or the face scan or fingerprint entry on a Windows device. So this is all enforced in conditional access. It is not something that we do on the device. This is conditional access evaluating. Do I trust that this was a strong device identity, a strong user identity? And if so, let's give them tokens to access some downstream resource. This is an important point to bring up because there is some confusion because some of the third-party credential providers like your Jamf Connects, your Xcreds, they do have options for doing things like launching web browsers on lock screens and having challenges for like app-based MFA, like push notifications to sign into the Mac itself. Platform SSO is not for that. Platform SSO is about proving to the conditional access engine that we have a strong device identity and a strong user identity before giving access to some resource protected by CA. All right, so
before you get into some demos, Michael, I think we have a few questions in the chat that I do want to circle back to. So we had somebody ask about passwordless usage. I know that on an earlier slide, you showed that Platform SSO can be used with passkeys and also for different passwordless deployments. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit more, as well as if you can use it in tandem with temporary access paths for bootstrapping those users for passwordless?
Yes, so for organizations that are going passwordless, we would expect that you would bootstrap the secure enclave key or smart card method, either using an existing passwordless credential in the user's account, like if they have a passwordless method on their mobile device, they could use that to bootstrap secure enclave key. Or if they don't have any pre-existing passwordless credential, you could use a temporary access pass to do that bootstrapping. So either option is available. So just like Windows Hello for Business or setting up a passkey on iOS or Android, you can use a temporary access pass to register for the secure enclave key method. But secure enclave key is we are treating it as the equivalent to Windows Hello for Business. So if your passwordless strategy is Windows Hello for Business on the Windows side, you should probably think about secure enclave key on the Mac side.
And then we have a follow-up question about if there are any special considerations with managed Apple IDs that we should be thinking about.
There's no real intersection between Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager and managed Apple IDs and Platform SSO today. Something we'd really like to see macOS eventually evolve into is having Platform SSO get set up during the out-of-box experience, where a user may be using a managed Apple ID in order to kick off like the setup assistant flows. But today they're pretty much completely separate. So if you're using managed Apple IDs, that's great. They'll work with Platform SSO. Like you can use them with devices that are using Platform SSO. If you're not using managed Apple IDs, also fine. Platform SSO has no real dependencies on it today.
Gotcha. And then one more question before I let you get into the demos, and we can address some more questions at the end. We had a future forward-looking question about if Secure, or if you know if Secure Enclave in the future would be able to sync local passwords and Entra ID passwords together.
We will never do that because the point of the Secure Enclave key is not to have the phishing resistant credential. So if we have this strong hardware backed credential, and then we reintroduce a phishable credential, we are lowering the security. So I'll talk about this in a little bit actually, but we want to start treating that local memorized secret on the Mac more like a PIN. So just like the PIN that you have on your iOS device or the PIN that you have on your Windows device, if you're using Windows Hello for Business, when you're using the Secure Enclave key, the local memorized secret on the Mac, from a security perspective, is becoming the equivalent of those PINs. So just like you don't sync the PIN on your iOS device to Active Directory, you don't sync the PIN on your Windows Hello for Business device to Active Directory, we want to maintain that same security stance here for the local memorized secret on the Mac side as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, let's get into some demos and we can circle back to some more questions at the end. Folks, feel free to pop more in the chat and we will go through them as they come up in the presentation as well. I'll try my best to align it with the content so that way we're not jumping back and forth, since some of these might be answered throughout the presentation.
All right, so the first demo that I'm going to show here is the Secure Enclave key registration experience. So one thing to note is you'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there is a pop-up notification from macOS itself in the notification center. This is actually controlled by the operating system itself. Microsoft doesn't really have much control over this other than pretty much just injecting our logo and maybe customizing the strings a little bit. But macOS actually decides when to show this. And again, if the company portal app is there and you've pushed down an appropriate, well-configured MDM profile, this pop-up notification will appear for the end user. The user can click on it and kick off their registration process. So I will play the video here. And so what you'll see is the user clicks register. They will have to do a local authentication just to prove presence on the Mac. And they will now see an Entra ID authentication screen. So in this case, I'm going to use a passkey I have on an iOS device in order to kick off this registration. So I'm using a phishing-resistant credential on one device to bootstrap a phishing-resistant credential on my Mac as well. So this is a very strong way of bootstrapping here. This is also where you could use a temporary access pass. Under the covers, we are going through that two-step process. We are doing the Entra ID join, so that device registration, and then we are also doing the user registration. So it all happened in one fell swoop from the user's perspective. And the final piece of the puzzle is the user goes and turns on company portal as a passkey provider. So pretty straightforward stuff. So at this point, this user now has that private key in the Secure Enclave that they can use to do FIDO authentication against Entra ID. The local password of the device has not changed. So this is where we were talking about how when we use the Secure Enclave key option, we don't sync it with the Entra ID password. We want to get away from these like centrally stored, stealable, phishable passwords. And so what we recommend here is you manage that local memorized secret with MDM policies to align it generally to the way you do PIN management on other platforms. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a little bit. The next thing that I'm going to show, let me get to the next slide, is the reauthentication flow. So I'm going to show that flow where you actually use the Touch ID sensor and that private key that's stored in the Secure Enclave in order to do a WebAuthn authentication. So this looks really complicated on the slide. I am not going to go into everything that's happening here. What I really want to emphasize is that from a user's perspective, this is actually really easy in practice. And you'll see this in the demo. It just flies by. All I really have to do is touch the Touch ID sensor on my Mac, and I'm signed right in. Under the covers, we are just doing standard WebAuthn protocol stuff that is phishing resistant. There is no credential that is going over the network that someone can intercept in a man-in-the-middle attack and potentially replay. There is no credential that the user can be tricked into giving up that an attacker can go use from any location, any device. This credential is only usable from this particular Mac with this particular Secure Enclave key in it. So showing what this looks like, I'm going to try to sign in and say I want to sign in with face, fingerprint, PIN, or security key. I am challenged in the WebAuthn flow, and I say I would like to scan my fingerprint, and I'm signed right in. So basically what I did there is I used my Mac as a jumbo-sized FIDO key. I did not need to insert any external FIDO keys. I did not need to use a smart card or any external hardware. I'm using that private key in the Secure Enclave of the Mac to do this very strong phishing-resistant authentication. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the nuances around pins and device management and why these pins are so much better than these centralized passwords that we synchronize in the password flow. Pins are tied to the device. Like if I tell you what the pin is for the Mac that I'm sitting on right now, that does you absolutely no good without driving to Seattle, breaking into my house, and getting physical access to this Mac. It is tied to the device and largely useless without physical access to that device or remote access to that device, potentially if you have some sort of remote way to compromise that device. They're also not transmitted to the server. So in this WebAuthn flow, we are not sending that local credential. Like when I do the Touch ID or if I used my local password on the Mac, it does not get transmitted to the server in these secure enclave or smart card flows. So it is much, much more difficult to steal because it's only really used locally to authenticate to the local hardware of the Mac. And they are backed by hardware. That is a really key point. Like when we actually do this authentication, it's not based on memorized secrets where we can, as humans who are mistake prone, can give those secrets up and make them easy for attackers to compromise. It is much harder if we are using them to unlock the actual credential, which is bound to the hardware. So we really want customers to understand that as we're moving into this world of using the secure enclave key, these local passwords on the Mac are really becoming the equivalent of those pins on iOS and Android devices or those pins on your Windows Hello for Business enrollments on Windows. And I'll talk a little bit about how customers manage like the Windows Hello for Business pins in a little bit. So you can see like what are the sorts of things you might want to consider. So on the deployment guidance side, there's a couple additional things that I want to touch on here. One is if you are still using macOS 13 Ventura, it's probably time to upgrade. Sequoia is right around the corner, probably coming out sometime this month, maybe. We'll find out next week potentially. But in Sonoma, which Apple released a year ago, Apple added a ton of quality of life features. And I'll talk about our implementation for some of these. Some of these we don't support yet. The big one is authorization groups and admin groups. But most of these are supported in Microsoft's implementation today. So smart cards were added in Sonoma. An actual user UX in the settings app was added in Sonoma. Some nice things like Kerberos SSO and local account creation were added in Sonoma. Ventura had some very basic support. So if you haven't done this upgrade yet, it's time. There's also a bunch of recommended MDM settings, most of which are probably specific to Sonoma here. But we want to make sure that if you're deploying, that you catch that some of these are borderline required. Like some things might work if you forget to set some of these, but you may have user experience issues or wonky behaviors. So what I would really encourage you to do, again, is think about using the secure enclave key authentication method. But the other settings that are super, super important are especially the one I have in bold here, which is use shared device keys. This is a prerequisite for many of the other features. And then the other one that's probably super important to not miss is this registration token one. We just recently updated our docs to try to make this one clearer. You should put it in exactly as it's written here. So bracket, bracket, device registration in all caps, bracket, bracket is what should be in your MDM profile. This is basically a variable that we use during the enrollment process to aid the end user experience during enrollment. But probably one of the biggest issues that I've seen when I work with customers who reach out and say, Michael, I'm using this thing, it's not quite working right, I'm not sure what's going on. The first thing we do is I check to see, did they turn on use shared device keys? And inevitably they didn't. We have them flip the switch to make sure that that's included in their profile, and magically stuff starts working better. So if you don't remember anything else from this slide, remember to turn on this use shared device keys setting. If you were to use Intune, the profile is going to probably look something like this on the right. Again, you can use other MDMs. I know other MDMs are working on deployment guidance on their side on how to configure these same profiles on their end. You can also just look at the Intune docs and translate those settings over into your MDM if they have the appropriate setting configuration stuff available. But if you're using Intune, this is largely what it'll look like. But one tip that I would give here is don't have two side-by-side profiles, one for enterprise SSO and one for platform SSO, they will probably conflict with each other. So when you roll out platform SSO, remove the user or device from the enterprise SSO profile you may have been using previously and put them into scope for the new platform SSO profile, and bring over whatever settings from your old profile into the new platform SSO profile you need to preserve. So if you have applications that you want participating in SSO that you had defined in the old profile, make sure those get added to the new profile. And we did put some instructions in our docs recently on how to do that for allow listing applications specifically. Consider how you are setting password policies in your environment. This goes beyond just how you're applying them on the Mac. If you are setting password policies in your MDM, you need to make sure that they are not in conflict with how you are configuring platform SSO. So if you're using Secure Enclave Key, if you set really complex password policies via MDM, you're probably going to have user experience issues. So again, we want to think about moving more towards like a PIN management scheme rather than setting passwords using some like frequent rotation, hypercomplexity, super long length that we might use in a pre-Secure Enclave Key environment. If you're doing password sync, make sure that if you are setting a password policy at all via your MDM, that it matches up with your Active Directory settings. If you don't do this, users can end up in a bad spot where they can't satisfy one of the two policies. The password's not complex enough for AD, or it's not complex enough for the MDM, and they'll basically just be locked out of authenticating on their device. So it's pretty bad. If you are using the Secure Enclave Key, generally, I think that you should try to align with how you're managing Windows Hello for Business pins. Out of the box, the Windows Hello for Business pin rules are a little bit weak for most environments. So what we generally recommend is setting the default rule for your environment to something like 6 to 8 characters required. Numeric only is potentially allowed. Setting no expiration. So we generally think that unless the security profile of the device has changed, like if the device is found to be risky or there's something wrong with it, like the antivirus is in an unhappy state because there's some malware on the device, unless that happens, you don't necessarily need to get the user to rotate that credential, that local PIN on the device. And then of course, we should generally allow biometric in most environments. So this is what most organizations are doing on the Windows side, and we should generally think about aligning to that on the Mac side. And we can do that via MDM settings on the Mac. On the password sync side, again, make sure that you're setting the requirements to generally line up between Active Directory and platform SSO or your MDM policy, or remove the MDM policy entirely if you would like platform SSO to be solely in charge. Another thing to make sure that you do is deploy our Chrome extension. The screenshot is slightly out of date because we did rename it to the Microsoft Single Sign-On extension. The identifier actually has not changed. It's really just a rebranding in the Chrome Web Store. But remember, with Platform SSO, we're moving to hardware-backed device certificates for the device identity. And the only way to get at that in Platform SSO is by talking to our broker. Chrome today does not have the native capability to talk to the broker like Edge and Safari do. So make sure you install the extension, which adds that capability so that Chrome can be broker aware and talk to the broker if it ever needs to get access to that device certificate. And it'll ask the broker to do the authentication on its behalf. All right, any questions, Bailey, or should I go into troubleshooting?
Nope, the biggest one was the link to the Chrome extension. So for the folks that are looking in the chat, I responded to someone else's question with that, but I also popped it down below. There were a few questions that we can circle back to, but they weren't exactly in alignment with where you were at now. So I think they may be better for the end. One that we can actually do now that I think could be helpful for folks is how you can restrict enrollment. So is there a way to just scope this to company-owned devices or another subset of devices for rolling this out to their users?
Yeah, that's a good question. So remember that Platform SSO is largely driven by your MDM policies. And so that really comes down to what is the capability of your MDM to make determinations between devices that are corporate owned or personally owned. Intune has a concept of doing that during device enrollment, where if a Mac has come through, say like ABM, and it's a it's a corporate owned device, typically if it's coming through ABM, Intune can flag that and mark it as corporate. Whereas if the device is coming through like an end user driven enrollment flow that's typical of BYOD, it can be flagged as a BYOD device. And so it really comes down to your MDM and your MDM's ability to, at the time of enrollment, determine corporate versus personal, and then its ability to scope policies to corporate versus personal. So in Intune, what you would do is you would basically make sure that your corporate devices are coming through ABM and getting flagged as corporate properly. And then you would target your MDM profile at only users on corporate devices. And this would allow you to say, have platform SSO applying to your corporate owned devices and not do any of this if a user's on a personally owned Mac, but still allow them to do a BYOD enrollment for other MDM reasons.
Gotcha. 2 more questions. One on the initial registration. So for folks who are familiar with using Nudge for the Authenticator app, what does that first time enrollment look like on that end user side? I know you walked through the technical flow, but is there anything that they should be aware of in terms of end user training or something that they might encounter upon that first registration experience?
Yeah, so I did show the end user experience for doing the actual registration action. The big thing is Apple doesn't give us the control today to mandate that a user goes through that experience. The user can ignore that notification pretty much indefinitely if they want. And so the way that we recommend handling that is by basically locking them out of accessing their resources until they complete the registration. So in Intune, this is an option again, where basically if the user does not complete the platform SSO registration, we will mark the device as not compliant. And then in your conditional access policies, you can do things like say, don't allow users to access resources unless they're on a compliant Mac. And de facto, if they don't complete that registration, which you should also have like user education and campaigns around making them aware that this change is coming, so you don't just like brick them without warning. But you tell the users this change is coming, you must do this enrollment. If you don't, by such and such date, you will be locked out until you complete it. And the way you would actually enforce that is by using conditional access to say, if a device isn't compliant, we will block it. And if they don't complete that platform SSO enrollment, Intune will not mark them as compliant.
And then the last question is that whether Secure Enclave Key would support unlock of File Vault within Mac.
Secure Enclave Key is no different than how File Vault works on any random Mac that is not integrated with like an on-prem AD environment today. Meaning File Vault has a requirement today for some sort of local memorized secret to unlock, and users can be placed within a group where they can use their local credential in order to do that unlock, so that they don't have to use like the File Vault recovery password every time or have 2 passwords, one for File Vault, one for their user account. So you'll see that if you have users today who are using like local accounts on their Mac and File Vault's enabled, and then you turn on Secure Enclave Key, their user experience essentially will not change from the experience of getting to their desktop the first time they boot up the Mac. They'll be challenged for that local memorized secret that they have on the Mac, which allows them to authenticate to the Secure Enclave Key, unlock the disk, unlock other key material like their Secure Enclave Key that's inside that Secure Enclave. But from an end user experience perspective, it looks like almost nothing changes.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And then we'll keep going through troubleshooting and wrap it up with go-dos, but folks, feel free to put other questions in the chat and we'll close with answering the rest of them.
Cool. So a couple things on troubleshooting. If you want to see the status of a device, again, if you're on Sonoma or Sequoia, there's an actual UX for this. So if you want to see if the device registration step completed successfully, you can go to the network server screen, and where you would previously have seen on-prem AD info, you will now see platform SSO info. So this tells you, did that first step of device registration succeed? And you can actually kick off a repair from here if it did not. Also, if you go look at the user account, if you look at the details on their account, you can see things like, did the user registration succeed? So you can see what method are they configured for? So here it's Secure Enclave Key. Did they successfully register? And then finally, did they get tokens in return? Meaning that PRT that primary refresh token that's going to be used to provide them with SSO to all their resources. So if any of this stuff is not showing as green, you may need to have the user go through a repair cycle. You can also find these things programmatically. So if you want to see, like, did they get a Kerberos ticket? What is their login type? What is the username? When are their tokens expiring? There is a command line interface that Apple provides here. It's app-sso platform-s that returns an awful lot of information about the platform SSO configuration on your device. And this can be very helpful for troubleshooting, as well as gathering information at scale to see the overall health of your fleet. There's a couple properties that we tend to recommend that you look at. So if the user experience is bad, like the user is not getting SSO, you want to check the SSO tokens and make sure that they are not expired. So you can see that the SSO token by default has a 14-day window, but again, these are generally refreshed on a 4-hour schedule. So you want to make sure that you're not outside of the 14-day window here, and you want to make sure that they are refreshing appropriately. You could also want to make sure that some of the configuration is correct, like extension identifier is specifying what is the broker on this device. So if this is showing incorrectly, or someone mistyped and they have a spelling error in here, that can obviously lead to issues. You want to check and make sure that the device registration completed successfully. And if you are using the Kerberos SSO integration, you want to make sure that you have Kerberos tickets, especially that TGT_AD one that is primarily used for getting Kerberos tickets for on-prem AD. Platform SSO actually does give you the ability to do SSO to both the cloud and on-prem AD in basically one deployment. You don't need to maintain the Kerberos SSO extension on the side. We can do a lot of the Kerberos heavy lifting on your behalf. So you don't have to have this like weird mix of like, sometimes they have to sign into the Kerberos SSO extension. Sometimes they sign into platform SSO. If you deploy this, the user signs into platform SSO, and we will prime all the Kerberos stuff to give them SSO to both on-prem and the cloud. We do have a troubleshooting guide at aka.ms/Apple SSO TSG. This can help with things like, how do I gather logs? How do I validate TLS settings on my device? TLS issues is like one of the top support drivers in our ecosystem for our SSO extensions. So definitely go look at that. There's a lot of good guidance there. And we have added some instructions for things around platform SSO. And depending on feedback from the community, we'll continue to iterate on what this troubleshooting guide says. All right, I'll close out with a couple go-dos. And then if there's any remaining questions, we can address those. So the first one is strengthen your environment. Please, please, please think about the phishing resistant credential stuff that I talked about. If you deploy password sync today, I firmly believe that many organizations will be coming back in a few years and redeploying Secure Enclave Key. If you're on the device management side, go talk to your identity and security teams, and they may have a pretty strong opinion on the need to go to phishing resistance right away. Alternatively, if you are not deploying phishing resistant credentials today, you may be aware that the US federal government is getting really big on mandating phishing resistance for federal agencies. But generally, these types of requirements and recommendations are going to trickle down from the US federal level to other organizations. So this need to be phishing resistant is coming for our industry as a whole. And so you can basically leapfrog past this, this issue by going straight to the Secure Enclave Key or smart card methods today. If you go with password sync, again, in a couple of years, I think you will be undoing that and redeploying Secure Enclave Key anyway. And if you do deploy phishing resistant methods, make sure you are protecting your resources with conditional access policies that actually mandate the usage of those phishing resistant creds. Try to reduce your attack surface and how often your users are using passwords. Along with that, make sure you are getting your enterprise ecosystem integrated with Entra ID so you get the most bang for your buck on this investment in phishing resistance and conditional access. So if you have SaaS apps or LOB apps, SAML apps, OIDC apps, get them integrated with Entra ID. So as you roll out these new credential types, you get the most benefit and most security improvement from their usage. Make sure that you're governing access to those applications. There's a lot of built-in governance capabilities within Entra ID. If you're big on using on Chrome rather than Safari or Edge, make sure you deploy that extension. And then from a user experience perspective, definitely get your Apple Business Manager deployment integrated with Entra ID. It's very useful to have Entra ID handle the authentication for signing into your managed Apple IDs as well, because you can use these phishing-resistant credentials that you're deploying through Entra ID for authenticating to ABM. Talk to your vendors. Not all feature requests necessarily should go Microsoft's way, although we're very active on like the Mac Admin Slack or the Mac Admins LinkedIn community. If you do have questions you want to pose to us, but sometimes we may say that's a feedback that you need to file with Apple or with another vendor. Like if you run into other apps from vendors that you work with, and those apps don't seem to play nicely with Platform SSO, make sure you talk to that vendor or send them Microsoft's way so we can talk to that vendor so that we make sure that this entire ecosystem works well together. Don't forget about iOS. We focused almost exclusively on macOS today, but there are phishing-resistant authentication options on iOS as well. We have FIDO keys, we have smart cards, passkeys are in public preview today in the Authenticator app, and then we have an SSO extension concept on iOS as well. Make sure you use these things on your iOS devices. And then deploy all the best features for your Mac. The more of this stuff you deploy, like automated device enrollment, phishing-resistant authentication, SSO, using these SSO extension concepts, and things like integrating the device compliance of your Mac with your Entra ID and conditional access deployment, the better your user experience will be with Entra ID, and the better your security will be on the Mac platform. With that, I am done with slides. So Bailey, if there's any additional questions, I can take them.
Yes, there are a few. So we have two questions that overlap talking about offboarding scenarios. So if it's somebody's last day and people want to boot them from their device, or if I have continuous access evaluation enrolled and I would want for it to see any sort of changes to that user, how would Platform SSO relate to that? Would I be able to leverage that in any way, or are there other tools that I should use instead?
MDM is generally the preferred method for locking a user out of a device in a modern authenticate or a modern management scenario. Like if you know that a user should no longer be accessing a device, you should go into your MDM and say like lock this device or wipe this device, depending on the severity of the issue. If you do have a user, if you are using Platform SSO and you want to take action on your user, you can do things like mark them as like revoke all their sessions or mark them as high risk. But generally, the user should be able to self-service heal themselves from that. Whereas if you're trying to get them locked out entirely, disable the user account, which will stop Platform SSO from getting new tokens, and lock their device via MDM.
Awesome. And then we have another question about the local password and the Entra ID password and whether or not they're synced, if we'd be able to see if they're the same in terms of that password. I know you answered that earlier, but just for the benefit of folks here, would you be able to re-answer that question as well?
Yeah, so from the device side, macOS will check. So the user has to provide the Entra ID password, but we never store them in plain text somewhere where you can do some like out of band comparison where you can see like what is the password in Entra ID and what is the password on the device. When they're stored at rest somewhere, they are always protected by hashing and other security measures like encryption. So there's not like a direct comparison. Basically, the way you can tell on the Mac if the password is the same, if you're using the password sync method, is if the user is getting those SSO tokens. If the password on the Mac is incorrect, the SSO stuff will stop refreshing. They won't be able to get fresh tokens. Something will be in a bad state. And then you'll know that something's out of sync, whether it's something broke outside of the password sync process, or if the user provided a stale password and couldn't get fresh tokens, things like that.
Awesome. And then I know that we just went public preview in May, but we already have folks that are curious about GA. Are there any dates or anticipated bits of information that we can share on that?
Unfortunately, there is nothing I can share here today. We definitely want to get to GA as quickly as we can, but there's a couple of internal things we'll need to sort out before we can start talking about dates publicly.
All right. And with that, I know we're at time. Thank you so much to everyone for joining our first episode of the revival of the 425 show. So thank you for folks sticking with us. We're excited that we're going to be having some great technical content coming up as well, trying to keep it in the level 300 to 400 type space. So that way we can really dive into some things that folks care about. Coming up in 2 weeks, we are going to have more of an overview of what's new within Entra ID. For those of you who are familiar with what Jorge Lopez and Grace Picking used to do, we're going to do that again. So I will be filling in for Grace, and I will be working with Jorge to give you all an overview of what's new. And then we'll have some exciting content planned for October as well. That'll be more technical presentation focused. If there's anything you are wanting to see out of this, please be sure to let us know. We're very much in listening mode, as this is us bringing this program back. And we want to make sure that we're benefiting the community as best as possible. I know that Jamie popped in the chat below that we're going to have an upcoming show on September 18th. And so I believe that is scheduled for 8 a.m. Pacific. And be sure to follow us on all of the appropriate channels with the Entra community page, as well as our YouTube channel with Microsoft Security, so you can see the latest and also get the recording to this episode so you can share it with some colleagues. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael and Bailey, for today. Again, please go ahead and register for our next session, and we will see you later. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.